This video is going to be a tutorial on how to set up the suspension on your mountain bike. This won't be a 90-second overview because I want this to be fairly comprehensive. But if you're familiar with my YouTube channel, you'll know that's my MO anyway. A lot of people are intimidated about suspension setup, thinking that you have to be a motocross mechanic to do it right. That's not really the case. It's fairly straightforward, so in this video I'm going to break it down and try to make it easy for you. Let's get started. The only thing that you'll need to do this service is a shock pump and a tape measure, and preferably a tape measure in metric units. Also, if you choose to change your volume spacers that you can do on a Fox fork, you'll need a 26mm socket wrench. Now this is one that I got directly from Fox, and it has the edges shaved down a little bit, and it makes it a lot easier to use because it doesn't slip off. If you use a standard socket wrench, you got to be very careful that you put pressure on to keep it from slipping off. Also, I did make my own sag meter, which I'll show you when we do the rear shock. And I got the idea from this Specialized one, but this one is designed with 15mm of sag, which is for my shock. So let's go ahead and do the first step. The first step in setting up your suspension is setting the sag on both the front shock and the rear shock. Sag is the amount the suspension compresses under normal rider weight, so when you're just sitting on the bike. Now when you set your sag, you want to do that fully kitted up. You want to have your CamelBak on if you wear a hydration pack. If you carry a water bottle in your jersey, you want to have that. So you want to be weighted down just like you would be when you're riding. Now Fox recommends 15 to 20% sag for the front fork and 25 to 30% sag for the rear shock. Oftentimes included with the suspension or a new bike will be an owner's manual that has a reference point of where to start. For example, for my rider weight, Fox recommends starting off with about 65 psi. If you don't have that owner's manual, usually you can go on the website. And let me show you Fox's website where they show a chart with how much sag to use in the fork and the rear shock. So this is the chart that I have pulled up on my iPad on Fox's website. And I'm using a 34 float fork, and my rider weight is between 140 and 150 pounds. So it says for that fork I should start with 68 psi. And the table listed on Fox's website for the shock doesn't have psi ratings because different suspension uses different leverage ratios, which means the pressure isn't going to be as straightforward as a fork. But it does show your sag as far as how plush you want it. So 25% sag will be firm and 30% will be fairly plush. To set the sag on an air fork, we're going to remove this top cap, and on the Fox forks, and I believe RockShox as well, it's on the left side of the fork. So we're going to take that aside, and we're going to thread our shock pump onto the fork to set the PSI. So with that top cap removed, you can see that we have a Schrader valve where the shock pump goes. And in case you're wondering about using a standard floor pump, you cannot do that. Floor pumps are high volume, lower pressure, whereas shock pumps are a lower volume but a high pressure. Alright, I've got my shock pump on, and looks like I have about 70 psi, so I'll let about 5 out. I'm going to get it down to about 65. And on your shock pump, you have a button that you can press to let a little air out. Just do a little bit at a time. So that's 65. Now I'm going to check my sag. Before you check your sag, make sure that the high-speed compression, also referred to as your lockout, which on the Fox forks is on the right side, make sure that's all the way open, and that would be all the way counterclockwise as far as it'll go. To check the sag, you're going to need something to hold on to, and I like doing this next to my workbench. It provides a really good surface for me to do this. So get on the bike. Again, make sure you have your CamelBak on if you wear one. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cycle the fork, kind of get the stanchions loosened up inside those seals, especially this one since it's a new bike. And then I'm going to slide the O-ring down on the stanchion tube all the way to the bottom. Now that I have the O-ring pushed all the way down, I'm going to get into my normal riding position. So put your hands on the handlebars. Again, you should have your water bottle or Camelback or whatever you use. If you carry one on you, have it on your body. And just sit in that position for about 5 or 10 seconds. And one trick that I do is I lock out the fork, and then I just kind of pull up a little bit on the stem, put a little gap between the seal and the O-ring down there. And then very carefully get off your bike. I'm pushing down on my workbench so I don't put any more weight on the front. And then the fork will return back to its normal travel and we'll measure the sag. Now this fork is a 150 millimeter travel fork. And if you weren't quite sure, you can measure it. And it's going to go from the seal down here all the way up to almost the top of the crown. Obviously the suspension is not going to compress all the way. So even though that goes almost to 160 millimeters, I know this is a 150 millimeter travel fork. So with the 150 millimeter travel fork, 15% sag would be about 22 millimeters and 20% sag would be 30. So what I'm going to go for is I'm going to try to go a little bit closer to 30, so about 28 millimeters of sag. So you can see my O-ring only went to about 17 millimeters. So I've got to let a little bit of pressure out of this fork to give me more sag. So if the O-ring is a little bit too low, in other words, you don't have enough sag, you're going to let some air out. If the O-ring were up too high and you've got too much sag, you're going to need to add some air. So I'm going to let out about 5 psi. So I'll hook my shock pump back up. And by the way, you can leave the shock pump attached to your fork or your shock while you're setting the sag, but I just don't like it banging around on my new bike while I do this. And when you hook a shock pump up, you're going to lose about 5 psi into the hose. So even though I set this about 68 or so, it dropped down to about 60. So now I'm going to go, well, I'll go just a little below 60 and then check my sag again. So I went through the same process a couple times and settled on 50 psi, and that gives me about 26 to 27 millimeters of sag on this fork. And that's why the charts given by the manufacturers are really just a starting point, because different bikes are going to put your weight in different areas of the bike. So a cross-country bike, you're going to be leaning more over the front end, and a trail bike, your weight's going to be a little bit more to the rear of the bike. And so that's why you really need to go through this process of setting the sag exactly to your riding position and your weight. Setting the sag for the rear shock is very similar, but you'll need to measure the length of the shaft of your shock. So from right about here where the seal is down to the bottom of the shaft. It can be a little challenging sometimes to get a tape measure in there. So if that's the case, you can take a piece of string, measure it, and then measure the length of the string. I've done that, and this shaft is 60 millimeters in length. So I'm going to go for about 27% sag on this, and that is about 16 millimeters of sag. So I want the O-ring to be 16 millimeters from the top of the shaft at this seal down to where the O-ring is. And this is where I'm going to use this little tool that I made. And I've made a gap that's 15 millimeters, so I'm going to go just below that gap. This is one that I used on another bike. But that's just kind of a measuring tool that you can use if you want to do that instead of trying to stick a tape measure in there. So let's get on the bike and I will check the sag on this shock. Alright, just like we did for the front, we're going to lean up against something. I'm putting the weight of my body on my hand on my workbench, which makes this a lot easier. Once you're on the bike, make sure that the lockout lever on your shock is all the way open. Once that lockout lever is all the way open, reach down and pull up the O-ring as far as you can go towards that seal, the top of the shaft. And then again, get in your normal riding position and just kind of sit there for a minute with your hands on the handlebars Try not to do any movements rocking back or forth. Once you've set for about 5 or 10 seconds, the trick that I like to do again is to reach down and lock out the shock. Kind of lean forward, put your weight on your bench or whatever you're using. Get off the bike slowly, and then we're going to check the sag. All right, using my little tool here that I made, I've actually got too much sag on this. So that's probably down to about 22 or so millimeters. So I'm going to add some pressure to this. So to change the pressure in a rear shock, you will have a little cap covering a Schrader valve where you'll hook up your shock pump. It looks like I have about 100 psi, so I'm going to go up to about 115 on this one. I actually settled on 120 psi, and that gives me about the 16 millimeters of sag that I was looking for in the rear shock. After you get your sag set up on your suspension, now it's time to set your rebound. Rebound is how fast the suspension will return after hitting a bump or after compressing, and it's a very important aspect in terms of the performance of your suspension. One thing that you can do for rebound is have a starting point based on the amount of PSI that you put in your shock or your fork. For example, I look on Fox's website and looking at a shock, if you have 280 to 300 PSI in your shock, Fox recommends that rebound knob, which I'll show here in a minute, turned all the way clockwise, in other words, all the way slow. So higher amounts of rebound means that the shock will return more slowly. Less rebound damping means that the rebound knob is turned more counterclockwise and it's going to return faster. So looking at that same chart, if you run 100 to 120 psi, Fox recommends turning that rebound knob 11 clicks from fully closed. So fully closed is all the way clockwise, backing it out 11 clicks, and that's almost fully open, and I'll show the number of clicks that I have on this shock. Rebound is a little more subjective than setting the sag. It's going to depend on your preferences and your riding style. For example, if you do a lot of jumping where the suspension compresses really hard, you don't want it to return too quickly and buck you off the bike. So you're going to want more rebound damping, turning that rebound knob more clockwise. On the other hand, if you ride trails that have smaller hits, but they come in rapid succession, and that describes the trails that I ride because we have a lot of routes that aren't real big, but there's a lot of them. So I want my suspension to return quickly after it hits a bump. If you have your rebound set too slow, the suspension will pack up. In other words, the suspension will compress and not return quick enough to set up for the next bump. On this fork, the rebound knob is the red one at the bottom of the right fork leg. So this one has 13 total clicks. So all the way clockwise, if I were looking underneath the bike, all the way clockwise would be fully damped. In other words, fully slow. Backing it out 13 clicks all the way open is going to make the fork return as quick as possible. Likewise, on the rear shock, you have a rebound knob that's also red, and this one has about 14 clicks. So again, all the way counterclockwise is fully open, all the way clockwise is closed. So I have the rebound knob on the front fork all the way open, all the way counterclockwise, and the fork returns really quickly. Now I'm going to turn it all the way closed and we'll see how slow it returns. So now with the fork fully damped, that red knob turned all the way clockwise, I press down and quite a bit slower. When I did this on my cross-country bike, it took literally about a second for the fork to return. So this one isn't quite as dramatic, but it is a lot slower returning than with it fully open. The way that we're going to set the rebound for the fork is to compress it really hard and then just let up with your hands and look at the front tire. If the front tire bumps off the ground a little bit, you need to slow the rebound damping a little bit. So I've got the rebound knob all the way open, all the way fast. I'm going to press down and let up and watch the tire and see if it bounces off the ground. And a lot of times it helps to have someone else look at the tire because it's kind of hard to see from up here, and you can even put your phone down there and record it if you want to get all high tech. But let's do that and see what it looks like on the camera. So this is slow motion of the rebound fully open or fully counterclockwise, compressing the suspension, letting it pop up. And keep your palms open, by the way, when you do this. You can see it bounces off the ground. Now I've added 4 clicks of rebound. I compress the suspension and it does not bounce too far off the ground. So I settled on 4 clicks from fully open. We're going to use a little bit different method for the rear shock. And we're going to do what I call the curb test. And you're going to ride off of a curb with your butt on the saddle. And you're going to watch your suspension. What you want to do is you want the suspension to return without oscillating. So in other words, when it comes back up from its compression, you don't want the suspension to kind of be bouncing after you ride off the curb. So we're going to set the rebound knob fully open all the way counterclockwise, so that's fully fast. We're going to ride over a curb and watch the suspension. So let's see what that looks like. And I don't have any curbs in my neighborhood, so I'm going to improvise with this. Alright, the first time I did this was with the rebound fully open or fully counterclockwise, also known as fully fast, and you can see how the shock oscillated quite a bit when it returned. Now I'm going to add 3 clicks from fully open, so turning it clockwise 3 clicks, and you can see the shock still oscillates some when it returns. It's slowing down a little bit. Now this is with 5 clicks from fully open, still getting a little movement when it returns. And now I'm going to add 7 clicks. So this right here is with 7 clicks, and you can see when it returns, it does not oscillate. Now because I know I like a faster rebound, I backed it out 2 clicks, so I settled on 5 clicks from fully open, again because I like a fast rebound. So that's how you want to get your rebound set, and then you're probably going to want to make some adjustments on the trail. So if you're out riding and you feel like the suspension is just kind of pogoing too much, you're kind of out of control because the suspension is returning too quickly, just turn that rebound knob clockwise a couple clicks and slow it down a little bit. On the flip side, if you feel like your suspension is not active enough, it's not lively enough and returning quick enough to set up for the next bump, then you're going to want to slow down or speed up your rebound and decrease the rebound damping by turning that red knob counterclockwise a couple of clicks. And after a couple rides, you should have it set the way you want it. The final step to setting up your suspension is somewhat optional if you have a Fox fork. Fox has volume spacers inside both the fork and the shock. I've never changed the ones in the shock, but I've done the ones in the fork, and that's what I'm going to show how to do in this video. So the volume spacers, if you add volume spacers, it's going to cause the fork to ramp up a little bit quicker. If you take out volume spacers, you're adding volume to the fork, which is going to make the mid-stroke a little bit more sensitive, and it's going to make the fork feel a little bit more linear in the sense that you're going to get full travel easier. If you do a lot of jumping, you're going to want the fork to ramp up more, so you're going to want to add volume spacers. I like taking out volume spacers because it gives the fork, like I said, that more linear feel, which is good on the trails that I ride with a lot of roots. So let me show you how to do that. Alright, so I've got the air cap removed as if we were going to add or remove air pressure. I'm going to take my 26mm socket wrench, and you really want to press down hard. I like leaving the bike on the ground, not in a work stand, because you don't want to strip that top cap. So push down hard as you loosen it, and that will loosen. I think it's about 50 Newton meters, so it's fairly snug but not too tight. Now that I've got that loosened, I'm going to let the air out. The reason I left the air in is so that I can loosen it by pressing down. So I'm going to let the air out of this fork. And I can typically use my fingernail. Sometimes I use a little screwdriver. There we go. Now I'm going to just loosen this all the way. Keep a little pressure on there, again, so it doesn't slip off, and strip that top cap. Alright, so this one comes with 2 volume spacers, these little green spacers, and these just kind of interlock together. So I'm going to slide one out, and there we go. So I've removed 1 volume spacer. That's all there is to it. And you're going to just thread this back in and add whatever pressure you settled on. I had settled on 50. So I'm just going to thread this back in, and we'll add the air. So there's my fairly comprehensive guide to setting up the suspension on your mountain bike. A final tip that I'll give you is that after you've ridden on a few rides, look at the O-ring. Check the amount of travel that you're getting. So before your ride, push that O-ring all the way down on the fork or all the way up on the shock. And then after your ride, check it. If you're not getting full travel on your fork or your shock, let about 5 psi out. And then on your next ride, do the same thing until you finish the whole ride and you're getting full travel. Now, on the flip side, if you're getting travel too easily on those, then you want to add some pressure. If you have any questions or comments about this video, please leave them below, and if it was helpful for you, give it a thumbs up for me. Thanks for watching. This video is going to be a tutorial on how to set up the suspension on your mountain bike. This won't be a 90-second overview because I want this to be fairly comprehensive. But if you're familiar with my YouTube channel, you'll know that's my MO anyway. A lot of people are intimidated about suspension setup, thinking that you have to be a motocross mechanic to do it right. That's not really the case. It's fairly straightforward, so in this video I'm going to break it down and try to make it easy for you. Let's get started. The only thing that you'll need to do this service is a shock pump and a tape measure, and preferably a tape measure in metric units. Also, if you choose to change your volume spacers that you can do on a Fox fork, you'll need a 26mm socket wrench. Now this is one that I got directly from Fox, and it has the edges shaved down a little bit, and it makes it a lot easier to use because it doesn't slip off. If you use a standard socket wrench, you got to be very careful that you put pressure on to keep it from slipping off. Also, I did make my own sag meter, which I'll show you when we do the rear shock. And I got the idea from this Specialized one, but this one is designed with 15mm of sag, which is for my shock. So let's go ahead and do the first step. The first step in setting up your suspension is setting the sag on both the front shock and the rear shock. Sag is the amount the suspension compresses under normal rider weight, so when you're just sitting on the bike. Now when you set your sag, you want to do that fully kitted up. You want to have your CamelBak on if you wear a hydration pack. If you carry a water bottle in your jersey, you want to have that. So you want to be weighted down just like you would be when you're riding. Now Fox recommends 15 to 20% sag for the front fork and 25 to 30% sag for the rear shock. Oftentimes included with the suspension